Somewhere between 50 and 90% of Tibet's population before 1950 were legally bound to a landlord for life, not by conquest, not by war, but by birth. And the landlord wasn't a king, a warlord, or a foreign empire. It was a monastery. This is not a story you've been told. This is not a political video. This is not about what happened after 1950 or who was right or who was wrong. This is about a social system that existed for centuries, documented, legal, and almost completely absent from the way the West talks about Tibet. Scholars estimate it affected the lives of between 2 and 5 million people. Almost none of them had a way to leave a written record of their own. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how it worked, how it held millions of people inside it for generations, and why it remains almost entirely invisible in mainstream Western history. To understand this, you have to set aside the postcard version of Tibet. The mountains were real, the prayers were real. But behind the incense smoke, there were account books, and in those account books, human beings were line items. Tibetan society before 1950 was organized into 3 layers. At the top sat roughly 200 aristocratic families. They had held their land and their titles for centuries. They didn't earn their position. They inherited it, along with everything and everyone attached to their estates. Just below them, and in many ways more powerful, were the great monasteries, Sera, Drepung, Ganden. These were not simply spiritual institutions. They were landlords, some of the largest landowners in all of Tibet, controlling vast estates worked by thousands of families. And at the bottom, holding everything above them upright, were the miser. Miser is the Tibetan word for a person legally bound to an estate, not by contract, not by choice, but by birth. Scholars estimate this category covered somewhere between 1/2 and 9/10 of the rural population. The exact numbers are debated. The structure is not. Not owning the land didn't mean simply lacking a title deed. It meant your labor, your time, and your children's futures belonged to someone else from the day you arrived in the world. Every miser family owed their estate something called ulag, compulsory unpaid labor, no fixed limit, no cap on how much could be demanded in a given year. In practice, a family might spend 1/3 of their entire working year performing tasks for the monastery before they were permitted to tend their own survival, carrying grain across mountain passes, constructing new temple buildings, staffing monastery kitchens for monks who had taken vows of poverty. The vow applied to the individual monk. It did not apply to the institution that owned 10,000 acres. And if you refused, you weren't just a difficult tenant, you were disturbing the sacred order, accumulating bad karma, endangering not just your own rebirth, but the spiritual welfare of your entire family line. The monastery didn't need to threaten violence in most cases. It had something more durable than violence. It had cosmology, when your oppressor controls not just the law and the land, but your understanding of why you suffer. Resistance doesn't feel like courage. It feels like damnation. That is not a metaphor. That was the theology, applied as policy. But the deepest mechanism in this system wasn't the labor quota, it was the loan. When a bad harvest came, and bad harvests always came, a miser family had one realistic option: borrow from the estate. The interest structures documented in monastery records were not designed to be repaid. They were designed to rotate. The principal shrank slowly. The interest compounded faster. Year after year, decade after decade, the math was never meant to resolve in the borrower's favor. And when the borrower died, the debt did not die with them. Monastery contracts from this period contain explicit inheritance clauses. The obligation passed to the eldest son. If he died young, to the next. If there was no son, the debt attached itself to daughters, to nephews, to whoever could be legally named the continuation of that original obligation. There are documented cases of families still servicing a debt in 1940 that their great-grandfather had taken on in the 1860s, 80 years of interest, 4 generations, repaying a number that was never designed to reach zero. The debt was not a financial instrument. It was a leash, and unlike a physical chain, it was invisible. It didn't require a guard, only that the numbers in the ledger be kept accurate. The monasteries were meticulous accountants. So why didn't people simply leave? Running was technically possible, but a miser who fled and was caught could be legally returned by force. Their remaining debt was increased as a penalty for the attempt. And in a world where the monastery controlled the local court, the temple, and the concept of karmic consequence, there were very few places to run to, and almost no one who would shelter you when you arrived. For the vast majority of miser families, literacy was not merely discouraged, it was forbidden. The only texts permitted were religious texts, interpreted by the same class that held the keys to your estate, your debt, and your soul. A person who cannot read, cannot access records, cannot verify claims, cannot even imagine in concrete terms a world built differently from the one they were born into. Ignorance was not a side effect of this system. It was the system's immune response. Most of the people inside it did not experience this as oppression. They experienced it as reality. When the people who count your debt and the people who guide your prayers answer to the same institution, you don't see a system, you see the shape of the world. This is not a uniquely Tibetan story. Medieval European peasants were told their station was God's design. The enslaved in the antebellum American South were told their bondage was the natural order. The miser of Tibet were told their chains were karma. Every society in history has built a story around its hierarchy, a story that makes the hierarchy feel inevitable, natural, even sacred. The vocabulary changes, the function does not. What made the Tibetan case distinctive was how completely the economic and the spiritual fused into a single structure. The man who counted your debt and the man who guided your prayers answered to the same institution. There was no separation between the temple and the ledger. They were the same building, and inside that building, a record was kept. Names, debts, estates, children, generation by generation, updated at birth, updated at death, maintained with extraordinary care. The mountains were real. The prayers were real. The devotion of millions of ordinary people was real. But so was the ledger, and the ledger did not record prayers.